At noon, and today's presentation. I'm Joe Hunt, Engineering 62, and I want to welcome you to today's presentation. I was going to begin my speaker introduction by saying how most of us are probably extremely relieved that the election is finally over. But now with recounts going on, I'm not so sure about that. But in any case, over the holiday I had occasion, because of a project I'm working on, to review the history of Renaissance Italy, particularly Florence. And it occurred to me that this was a time in Italy where the transitions of power were not exactly happy times necessarily, because it was a time of the Machiavellis, the Borgias, the Medicis, and armies of condottieri running up and down Italy. As a result, the transitions of power were quite often filled with lots of violence and more mayhem than you can believe. So at least perhaps we should be thankful that we live in a place and time where the transfers of power are peaceful, certainly peaceful with respect to Renaissance Florence. Now that's my somewhat narrow and personal take on the election, but with us today, we're very happy to have a speaker with us who will give us a more general overview as well as some pertinent details. And that speaker, who we're happy to welcome back again, is Professor William G. Mayer. He's currently a professor of political science here at Northeastern and has been a member of the faculty since 1991. I also checked, and I'm happy to report that he is very highly regarded on ratemyprofessor.com. He's been the author or co-author of 10 books. Two of ones that I found had interesting titles are The Front-Loading Problem in Presidential Nominations, and another was The Swing Voter in American Politics. He has also written numerous articles in leading journals, and these articles concern such topics as voting, public opinion, media, and politics. One of those titles that I found somewhat intriguing was In Defense of Negative Campaigning, that appeared in the Political Science Quarterly several years ago. I don't think you'll be surprised to learn that he has received many honors and awards over the years and has been called by one as the nation's leading academic authority. Now, many of you here today may remember last March, and if you were here with us then, you will recall that the professor discussed the progress of the nomination races and their likely outcomes. Today, he's here to discuss with us how and why the 2016 election unfolded the way it did. Let's welcome Professor Mayer.
Well, thank you can everybody hear me? Thank you very much for having, you can't. See if I can turn this a little. How's this? Better? Okay, good. Well, thank you for having me back. I'm really delighted to be here. The title that under which this talk was advertised, the 2016 election, a look backward and forward, was one that I came up with a couple of months ago, before I had any real idea of how the elections were going to turn out. Had I been asked for a new title, say about a week ago, I might have come up with something more like this, attempting to explain the inconceivable. After the election was over, it was often suggested that the media underestimated Trump's chances of winning the election because they all disliked him so much. Well, I was certainly no fan of Trump's, but I was no great admirer of Hillary Clinton either. Some of you may know that I write occasional op-ed pieces for the Boston Herald these days. And back in August, I wrote 2 pieces, one of which explained why, in good conscience, I couldn't vote for Trump, and the other explained why I couldn't vote for Hillary Clinton either. If you're curious, I ended up voting for the Libertarian Party presidential candidate, but as I explained in one of those op-ed pieces, I only voted for him because I knew he couldn't win. If I had thought he had any real chance of winning, I wouldn't have voted for him either. Well, biased or not, I was, like virtually everyone else, very surprised to go to bed early on the morning after the election, and with the knowledge that Donald Trump had just been elected president. Why were we all so surprised? Well, as an immediate matter, I think it was because we had so little advance warning about what was going to take place. The polls, which are the main device that most of us use to have a sense of how the election is going, had given us very little indication that a Trump victory was in the cards. Let me give you just a little bit of data to think about. For the benefit of political junkies like myself, there are now a couple of what are sometimes called polling aggregation websites. And these are internet sites that they don't do any actual polling themselves, but what they do is they compile the findings of all the major public pollsters, ABC and CBS and Gallup, when Gallup was doing polling, and then they compute a kind of running average of the results. And according to what, for my money, is the best of these websites, it's called realclearpolitics.com. Some of you may go there occasionally. Clinton had led the presidential race pretty much continuously from the moment pollsters first began asking survey questions about who would you vote for if the race was Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump. That was in July of 2015 when they first started asking questions. The size of her lead had fluctuated over time, of course, but only twice during 17 months did Trump briefly hold a narrow lead in the polls. He had a narrow lead in late May of 2016, just before he clinched the Republican nomination, and then for 3 days right after the Republican National Convention. As recently as October 18th, according to the Real Clear Politics data, Clinton was leading Trump by 7 percentage points. The race narrowed a bit after that, but by November 3rd, she was ahead by only 1.3%, but her lead actually seemed to widen a bit after that. On November 7th, the day before the election, according to an average of all of the major polls that had been taken, Clinton was ahead by 3.2 percentage points. So let me just put that in context. You can see the first column of numbers is the final poll results. And Clinton was leading Trump by 3.2 percentage points, as I just said. As it turns out, she did win the popular vote, and actually, as late votes have been trickling in, her margin in the popular vote seems to be expanding a bit. The numbers I've got that I put up there were ones I looked up just last night to try and be as fresh as possible, and they show Clinton winning the popular vote by 1.8%. So if you think of it in those terms, the polls actually weren't that far off. Still, they were off, and what's interesting is that they were consistently off. There was one strange set of poll numbers that were produced by a group at the University of Southern California that kept showing Trump ahead. But other than that, everybody's numbers showed Clinton up at the end by something like 3 or 4%. So why were they off? Well, this is the sort of question that academics love to think about because it involves numbers and a lot of esoteric data crunching, and my guess is that they will look at three possible answers. One is, was it possible that there was a last-minute surge to Trump? Polling, as its practitioners will remind us, are only a snapshot. Polling is a snapshot of the electorate, and that means that things can and do change. Most of the final poll results that I've talked about concluded their polling. They had to conclude it on November 6th or November 7th. So perhaps in the last 24 hours or on Election Day itself, a critical proportion of the late deciding voters resolved their ambivalences in Donald Trump's favor. Well, maybe, but I can't find any evidence that this happened. If you look at, again, the Real Clear Politics data, it's interesting to note that in the closing days of the election, Clinton's lead actually seemed to be widening a bit rather than narrowing. There is also a question on the media exit polls. I assume you all know that a lot of the numbers that get thrown around in the days immediately after an election are taken from a series of polls that are done by a group called the National Election Pool that is funded by 5 or 6 different major media organizations, including the 3 major networks and CNN, and I think the New York Times and the Washington Post all contribute to it. And these exit polls had a question in them that said, that asked people when they finally decided to vote. 8% of the voters said they had decided in the last few days, before the election. But those people divided their votes evenly between the major candidates, 43% for Trump, 43% for Clinton. So I can't find any indication to date that there was really a last-minute surge towards Clinton. Well, the second possibility is that there was a hidden Trump vote. What do I mean by that? Well, when Trump lagged in the polls throughout the fall campaign, Trump had an ambivalent relationship with the polls. He loved them when they were showing him ahead. He despised them when they were showing him behind. And when they were showing him behind during the fall, he and his supporters sometimes claimed that there were lots of people who were going to vote for Trump when they were inside the privacy of the voting booth, but they were, for various reasons, unwilling to admit it in public. Notice that the number of hidden Trump voters didn't have to be especially large. If just about a little under 1% of the electorate said they were voting for Clinton when they were really intending to vote for Trump, that would have been enough to account for the discrepancy between the polls and the final results. I don't recall seeing it mentioned in any of the post-election commentary, but there actually is good evidence from previous elections that some people who get interviewed in surveys are reluctant to admit that they're going to vote for the less popular candidate. The most impressive demonstration of this came from a series of kind of polling experiments that the Gallup poll used to do. This was back during the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And back then, Gallup used to do all of its interviewing in person. Today, if you see a poll talked about in the news, it is almost certain that the poll was done either by telephone, meaning they called up people, or increasingly on the internet. Internet polling is problematic, but for reasons that I'll explain in a second, it's increasingly at least being tried. Very few people do in person. It's too expensive, and the lag between when you finish the surveys and when you process the data is too long for a lot of media organizations. But back in the, as I said, from the start of its operations in the 1930s to the late 1980s, Gallup did all of its interviewing in person. And since they were doing in-person interviews, Gallup was able to do the following experiment. they would interview half of their sample, a randomly selected half, by asking them in the traditional way, orally, who they were going to vote for. You know, if the election were held today, would you vote for Barry Goldwater or Lyndon Johnson? But the other half, they would give of the sample was given a secret ballot that was, they were given a piece of paper that was conspicuously marked secret ballot. And they were asked to fill that out in private, to put it in an envelope, seal it, and give it to the interviewer. And Gallup found quite consistently that those who filled out this so-called secret ballot, which of course wasn't really all that secret, since after the pollster left the person's house, he or she could easily open it. But just doing that produced slightly but consistently more votes for candidates like Adlai Stevenson in the 1950s or Barry Goldwater in 1964. So maybe there was this hidden Trump vote. Final explanation really gets to the heart of the whole polling enterprise. As anyone who does actual polling will tell you, it has become an increasingly difficult task to draw and interview a reliable random sample of the American population. If any of you have children or grandchildren who are thinking of getting into polling, you might want to steer them to another career choice. In particular, there's been a huge increase over the last several decades in what is called the survey non-response rate. I do have that up already. If you tried to do a telephone poll in the mid-1970s, a reasonably large percentage of the phones you called would actually produce a completed interview. That is to say, a real human being would answer the phone and then agree to be interviewed. Today, the pollsters I've talked to all report that, first of all, a lot of the calls aren't answered, or they reach only an answering machine. Second, that if you do reach a real person, that person is increasingly likely to say, I'm tired of all the calls, quit calling me, and no, I'm not going to talk to you this time. One pollster I spoke with just a few weeks ago said that as recently as about 5 or 10 years ago, his interviewers had an interview completion rate of about 15%, which is actually quite a bit lower than it was several decades ago, but still means that for 1 out of every 6 calls you make, you get a completed interview. Today, he said it's down to about 3%. Now, when completed interviews are that difficult to get, there's a real danger that the people you do reach are in some important way very unrepresentative. Maybe they're people with particularly strong opinions who are dying to reveal them to somebody or other. Maybe they are people who are more politically active and therefore more interested in what the questions you're asking are. In any event, it's quite likely that for various reasons they may be unrepresentative. And as I say, if this is the case, and it's definitely the case that there has been an increase in the survey non-response rate, we may have, the whole polling enterprise may be in trouble in the future. The solution, of course, is to do less polling, but how to convince the whole industry not to do that is the problem. Well, so that's why the polls were off and why most of us were totally unprepared for a Trump victory on November 8th. But why was the election so close to begin with? As Hillary Clinton reportedly asked a group of her supporters, why aren't I ahead by 50 percentage points? And there are, I think, 2 major reasons why Clinton didn't win by a more decisive margin in the popular vote now I'm talking about. First, while Trump was very unpopular with the voters, so was Clinton. When I gave a talk when I talked to you to NU at noon back in March, you may remember that I said we are about to nominate the 2 most generally unpopular politicians in America as our presidential candidates. Well, we went ahead and did it. According to those same media exit polls I was referring to earlier, only 43% of the voters said they had a favorable opinion of Clinton. 55% viewed her unfavorably. Those are not typical in presidential elections. Usually favorables outnumber unfavorables. Trump's numbers, fortunately for Clinton, were even worse. 38% favorable, 60% unfavorable. But I think the bottom line is that had the Democrats nominated virtually any other candidate besides Clinton, they probably would have won a clear, decisive victory over Trump. And by the same token, had the Republicans nominated somebody besides Trump, he would have defeated Clinton quite comfortably, not only in the Electoral College, but in the popular vote. Trump was one of the few people who could make Clinton a competitive candidate. Now, time doesn't permit me to go through an exhaustive list of Clinton's failings. Suffice it to say that I think a lot of Democrats, including a substantial majority of Democratic Party leaders and elected officials, made the mistake of dramatically overestimating Hillary Clinton's potential appeal to the American electorate and underestimating the impact of all her personal baggage. Part of the problem, I think, is that Democrats learned the wrong lesson from the last major Clinton scandal. In Bill Clinton's second term, as you probably recall, he was hit with accusations, later proven true, that he had had an affair with a White House intern and then lied about it during a civil deposition. When those charges were first aired, lots of people, not just Republicans, but Democrats and members of the press, said that if the accusations were proven true, there would be widespread public outrage and the Clinton presidency might well be finished. In fact, the American public was surprisingly unimpressed by the whole controversy. Clinton's approval ratings were simply unaffected by the whole scandal. When the House nevertheless brought impeachment charges against him, polls regularly showed that a substantial majority of the public did not want the Senate to convict him. And of course, in the end, it didn't. So when Republicans charged Hillary Clinton with maintaining a private email server, at least in violation of State Department policy, and thereby endangering classified information, I think a lot of Democrats were inclined to dismiss the whole thing as just another tempest in a teapot. One more attempt by the Republicans to manufacture a scandal where none really existed. But this time there was solid evidence that the public took the email scandal seriously. The national exit polls, for example, included a question asking how much Clinton's use of a private email server bothered them. Fully 45% of the voters said it bothered them a lot. Only 19% said it didn't bother them at all. Excuse me if I keep turning around, but I want to make sure I'm on the right slide. Moreover, many of Clinton's faults were of a nature so as to partially neutralize some of Trump's worst failings. Yes, Trump had an appalling record of treating women, but so did Bill Clinton. And Hillary had, at least to some extent, helped cover up and excuse her husband's behavior. Yes, it was a huge problem that Trump was unwilling to release any of his tax returns, but Clinton was unwilling to reveal any of her Wall Street speeches and many of her so-called private emails. Yes, Trump had a long history of using his wealth in inappropriate ways, but the Clinton Foundation's record was also exceedingly problematic. Trump lied a lot, so did Clinton. For all that, had the 2016 election simply been a popularity contest between Clinton and Trump, Clinton would almost certainly have won. As the data I put up a minute ago indicated, she was unpopular, but he was even more unpopular. But there was one other thing that dragged down Clinton's candidacy. Simply put, Clinton suffered from being the candidate most closely associated with Barack Obama. This was a year when the voters wanted change, and Clinton couldn't convince people that she would really bring change. She seemed to be the candidate of more of the same. This is a sentiment, I should say, that often sets in when one party has held the presidency for 8 consecutive years. Even when a party has handled that office, the presidency, reasonably well, a feeling seems to take hold of the voters after 8 years that says it's time for a change. Yes, they've dealt with some things okay, but there are other things they haven't dealt with. Let's give the other folks a try. If you're interested in predicting the results of a presidential election well before it happens, turns out you could have predicted 15 of the last 17 elections if you knew just one piece of information. How long has the party currently in the White House been in control of the presidency? And let me show you the data up here. The column headings there indicate whether the, can everybody, am I in the way of anybody seeing the data? The column headings separate 2 conditions. One is if the current president's party has only been in the White House for the last 4 years. That was the situation, for example, that faced Barack Obama in 2012. Up through 2008, the Republicans had held the White House. The Democrats had only been there 4 years. Similarly, it was the situation that faced George W. Bush in 2004. And when that's the case, the incumbent party wins, or has won since 1952, 7 out of 8 elections. By contrast, when the party of the incumbent president has been in the White House for 8 or more years, they have lost the next presidential election 8 out of 9 times. A pretty impressive record. Now, as I say, this kind of feeling seems to occur all the time, regardless of who's been president. But it was, I think, particularly potent in 2016. To put the matter bluntly, and I keep telling this to Democrats and they keep resisting it, but I'm convinced it's true, the Obama presidency was pretty much a disaster for the Democratic Party. And it's hard to read the 2016 results as anything less than a repudiation of the Obama presidency. Yes, Obama managed to get himself reelected in 2012, but by almost any other measure, the last 6 years have been devastating for the Democrats. They lost very heavily in both 2010 and 2014, added all together with some very small gains they made in 2012, and the Democrats have lost a huge number of seats in the House and the Senate. They've lost a huge number of gubernatorial offices. They've lost almost 1,000 seats in American state legislatures. Obama retains, I think it's fair to say, a certain measure of personal popularity, partly perhaps because he's looked good in comparison to both Trump and Clinton. But many of his most salient policies are widely disliked. One such issue clearly was Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. And if there was a last-minute shift towards the Republicans in 2016, and I do think there is some evidence that that occurred in many Senate races, I think this may have been one of the principal causes. The Affordable Care Act has long been viewed unfavorably by most Americans, but it proved to be a particular problem in this election because, as you may remember, the new health care price tags were released just about a week before the election. And lots of people faced the prospect of paying something like 25% more or 50% more for the health care plan that they were in. Another major problem was Obama's handling of the terrorism issue. Yes, he kept us out of a major war, but at the price of allowing ISIS to grow and spread. In the exit polls that were conducted in conjunction with this election, only 6% of the people thought that the fight against ISIS was going very well, while 53% said it was going somewhat or very badly. Finally, there was the economy. There's no doubt that Obama inherited a very bad economy from George W. Bush. But there's also good evidence that in historical terms, this has been a very slow and unimpressive recovery. After just 4 years, a lot of Americans were willing to give Obama another 4 years on the thought that his policies deserved to have a better try to have their full effect. But after 8 years, I think a lot of people had run out of patience. Again, there's a good exit poll question on this that measures this sentiment. Asked to describe the condition of the national economy, only 36% described it as excellent or good, versus 63% who said it was not good or poor. So add all that together, and it was a tactical mistake, though perhaps an unavoidable one, for Clinton to link herself so closely with Barack Obama. If the presidential election doesn't convince you of this point, consider the congressional elections. Though it's been overshadowed by the presidential results, at every other level of American politics, this was a good year for Republicans. When this election cycle began, it was widely expected that 2016 would be a good year for the Democrats, a year when they would make major gains in both the House and the Senate. On the House side, the Republicans were at their highest level since 1928, and there tends to be a dynamic in House elections where if you're very high up after one set of elections, you're going to come down in the next. There's a kind of long-run equilibrium. So given how high the Republicans were, that meant that they were holding on to a lot of seats that were normally Democratic. And therefore, there were predictions that the Democrats would pick up about 15 House seats, maybe as many as 32, in which case they would have won back control of the House from the Republicans. Well, in fact, there's 2 seats still out, but it now looks like the Democrats will have picked up just 7 seats. The Democrats should have done even better in the Senate. Only a third of the Senate, of course, is elected every 2 years. And the third that was up for election in 2016 was disproportionately Republican. Specifically, there were 34 seats at stake this year, and 24 of them were already held by the Republicans. So if the Senate elections had just split evenly, 17 for the Republicans, 17 for the Democrats would have picked up 7 seats. In fact, there's one still undecided, but it now looks like they will pick up just 2. And that means that they will not retake control of the Senate. Put another way, at the beginning of this election cycle, there were 10 Senate seats that were widely thought to be in play. Since only one of those seats was held by a Democrat, it was thought that those numbers, too, widely favored the Republicans. Well, as it turns out, the Democrats won only 3 of those 10 elections. It really was a very good year for the Republican Congressional Party. Now, since most of what I've had to say today is probably depressing to a lot of you, let me end on what at least a lot of you will regard as a cheerier note. Though they're riding high today, a good case can be made that the Republicans are sitting on a potential disaster. Trump has raised very high expectations about among a lot of his followers as to what he will do as president, and I think there's very little chance that he can deliver on a lot of his promises, or that many of his proposed policies, if they are actually enacted and implemented, will work out half so well as he imagines. More than that, this is a man, I think, who does have some problems that make one wonder whether he will be an effective president. My reading of him, to be blunt, was that he was a person of very little judgment, very little discipline, very little knowledge of the issues, very little recognition of how little he knew about the issues, and very little willingness to listen to other people. And to quote something Richard Nixon said a little more than 50 years ago, Now he doesn't have Hillary Clinton to kick around anymore. From here on in, he will be judged more fully on his own record, his own accomplishments. If Republicans are looking for something that will snap them out of their euphoria and bring them back down to earth, they don't have to go too far back in history. Just 8 years ago, Democrats were convinced that they had arrived at the promised land. Not only had Obama just been elected, and by a considerably larger electoral margin than Donald Trump, but there were also large Democratic majorities in both houses of Congress. And many Democrats were convinced that not only had they triumphed in that one election, but that Obama's victory signaled the beginning of an entirely new era in American politics, one in which the Democrats would dominate elections for the next generation. A good representative of this type of thinking was a column by Hendrik Hertzberg in the New Yorker magazine. He wrote, "This election was so extraordinary in so many ways," and I'm talking now again about the 2008 election. "This election was so extraordinary in so many ways that its meaning will take many years to play out and many more to be understood. But there is already the feel of the beginning of a new era. As in 1932 and 1980, a crisis in the economy opened the way for the rejection of a reigning approach to government and the forging of a new one. Emphatically, comprehensively, the public has turned against conservatism at home and neoconservatism abroad. The faith that unfettered markets and minimal taxes on the rich will solve every domestic problem, and that unilateral arrogance and American arms will solve every foreign one, is dead for a generation or more. And the electoral strategy of cultural resentment and fake populism has been dealt a grievous blow." Well, it didn't quite turn out that way. Largely because, as I've argued, Obama turned out not to be a very effective president. If you're anxious to see the Democrats revive their fortunes at the congressional and state legislative level, moreover, 2016 may turn out to be very good news. It is historically very difficult for a party to improve its position in Congress when they also hold the White House. Usually people take out their frustrations with the president by electing a whole bushel full of representatives and senators from the other party. That, of course, happened to Obama. It also happened to George W. Bush. In 1994, it happened to Bill Clinton. Against that background, it will not greatly surprise me if 2018 is a really good year for the Democrats. And what of 2020? Well, if we've learned nothing else this year, it's that, to quote that great philosopher Yogi Berra, it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future. 4 years ago, who would have predicted that Donald Trump would today be the president-elect? Thank you very much. And now, is there a microphone or?
If you could just repeat the question.
I'll just repeat the question. Go ahead.
I was a political science major at Northeastern.
Oh,
And I also have an MBA.
wow.
What I found you said was very interesting and it answered a lot of questions that I've had. One of the things I wanted your view on, I don't recall, and maybe you're missing something, that the lack of bipartisanship and the way that the Congress and the president work was ever as difficult as we saw in this last 8 years. And I'm just wondering, if you look back in history, was this just something that does happen every now and then, or was this a different situation?
She asked about the situation, the state of relations between the president and Congress and how bitter it was, and asked if this was unusual or if this was something that happens all the time. At least in the, if you look for about the last 70 years, say, it was once the case that there was a fair measure of bipartisanship in Congress. largely because the two parties were fairly diverse. There were a fair number of liberal and moderate Republicans. There were a fair number of conservative and moderate Democrats. Today, there are very few moderates of either party and essentially no liberal Republicans and no conservative Democrats. And there has been a progressive decline in bipartisanship or cooperation in Congress. It was bad during Bill Clinton's time. It was worse during George W. Bush's time, at least once we got over the initial shock of 9/11. And it's been even worse in Barack Obama's time. And I fully predict it'll be a whole lot worse, or it'll be just as bad during the Clinton presidency. Now, there have been times when in previous American history when it's also been bad. The state of relations between the parties leading up to the Civil War was very bad. In some of the in the elections or in some of the Congresses in the late 1700s. So it's not absolutely unprecedented, but it is certainly anybody who remembers back to the 1950s or 1960s has to be impressed at the decline in the ability of the Democrats and Republicans to get along, and the shriller tone of a lot of the rhetoric.
Yeah. On local elections, is a process for recall elections. Is it any mechanism like that for a federal election?
Short answer is no. No, there's no provision at all in the federal Constitution for recall elections. Like it or not, we're stuck with Trump and Pence for 4 years. And similarly with, we're stuck with the current House of Representatives for 2 years. I'm excluding, obviously, things like deaths and resignation. That would, but there is there's nothing in the federal Constitution that permits recall of any sort.
Since the margin in the election was very tight, do you have any statistics that show what the impact of Comey's coming out 11 days before the election, the email thing again?
The question was about the impact of James Comey, the FBI director's announcing, was it 11 days before the election, that he was reopening the investigation against Clinton, and then about, 5-6 days later, he announced that he was closing it up again. That is a question that will be widely disputed. In the immediate aftermath of it, it seemed as though it tightened the race somewhat. But it's, there were lots of short-term fluctuations that may not have had much impact on the final result. So teasing out that it obviously didn't help her. I think it reminded a lot of people of, there seemed to be a kind of a dynamic in this election where Clinton seemed to have a normal lead in the polls of about 4%. And every time she would get above that, something would come along that would remind people of why they disliked her. And so her lead would narrow. And if it got any closer than that, something would come out that would remind people of why they disliked Trump. And the margin would widen again. But I don't have a great answer to the Comey question, and it will be difficult to tease that out from a whole lot of other things that were going on there at the end.
Obviously, the popular vote got more votes, but she's not president because she won the electoral college. What are your thoughts about that, electoral college, the way it operates?
I have, I should say at other times in my career as a political scientist, I've defended the Electoral College. I have increasingly come to the conclusion that we should get rid of it. It just seems, I mean, I've written a number of articles about about why the Constitutional Convention did what it did in relationship to presidential selection, about how it worked out in the earliest elections. I can defend why they chose this system in 1787. I would find it much more difficult to explain why we still have it in 2016. Now, it is only fair to Trump to say, if it had been decided by popular vote, he might have waged a very different campaign. He would not have spent time, for example, in New Hampshire. He would have spent a lot more time in California. It is also the case that if we move to a popular vote system, that there will be a lot more concern about the possibility of vote fraud in certain kinds of states. Because if you want to look, this year, if you want to know why Hillary Clinton won, and it turns out her margin in the popular vote is now up to something like 2.2 million votes, whereas when Al Gore beat George Bush in the popular vote, he beat him by about 500,000 votes. It turns out almost all, well, no, not just almost all of that margin is from California. You take out California, and Trump wins in the popular vote count by about 1 million votes. But anyway, the short answer is, well, I should say the short answer is twofold. One, I don't think the Electoral College is a good thing. Two, given that the Republicans have won twice in the Electoral College while failing to win the popular vote, there is zero chance this current Congress is going to change it. Maybe if in 2020 Trump wins the popular vote and loses in the Electoral College, Republicans will sit down and think seriously about changing things. But at least for the moment, I don't see a whole lot of likelihood that something's going to be done differently. Somebody else over here? Yeah, go ahead.
Given the composition of Congress, the way things turned out, do you have any forecasts about what they might agree on for a program that Trump supports?
The question was, given the composition of Congress, is there a likelihood that they can agree on a program that Trump supports? Well, the first point to note is that Trump has more than enough votes in the House to get his program through. He's got the Republicans have a majority of more than 40 seats in the House. And House rules permit the majority party, they give it a lot of power to control the agenda, to affect what bills are brought up and what aren't, what amendments will be permitted and what ones won't, how much time you can spend debating a particular proposition, and so forth. So the House will not be the problem. The problem will be the Senate. There, the Republicans have a majority, but a narrow majority. Assuming they win the Louisiana Senate race, which they probably will, the Republicans will have 52 seats. The problem is that due to the abuse of the filibuster, it now typically takes about 60 votes to get anything through the Senate. There are not a lot of major projects on which the Republicans will be able to get the 8 or more votes that they need from the Democratic side of the aisle. There are a number of kind of subterfuges that they can use to get around that, at least in some cases. It is also the case that some of what they want to do was implemented by Barack Obama through executive order rather than through legislation. And the good news for Democrats was he was able to do some things that they liked. The bad news is that since they're not enshrined in legislation, President Trump can very easily undo them. For example, the treaty with the nuclear treaty with Iran was not formally a treaty, because if it had been a treaty, it would have had to be submitted to the Senate and approved by majority vote. I'm sorry, two-thirds vote, excuse me, two-thirds vote. Well, and that wasn't just wasn't going to occur. So Trump can easily announce when he takes office, I'm not going to abide by that treaty. Now, as will be true of a lot of the things that Trump wants to do, he will find that undoing what Obama did is more easily said than done. And the Iran treaty is a good example. It is very easy to say we're no longer adhering to that treaty. The problem is that we've already given them $1.7 billion in cash. We've already dismantled the sanctions regime that brought them to the table in the first place. And it's probably going to be difficult to reassemble those sanctions, which require a fair amount of multilateral cooperation. It does us no good to say we won't we won't trade with Iran if Germany and France and Russia all say, oh, we don't mind it. You know, it's difficult to predict in advance how, you know, what they can, what exactly they will be able to get done. But there is a fair amount he can do by executive order. And there are some things like the budget. The budget is a special case. The budget does not require a two-thirds vote, 60 votes to cut off debate. There's a special provision in the Senate rules that say budgets only, you can't invoke a filibuster on a budget. So they will no doubt use the budget to accomplish a lot of stuff. And if all they want to do is say, cut off funding to public broadcasting, which is one thing that they've talked about doing for a number of years, all they need is a majority in the Senate to get that done.
Two related questions. One, is there any way to know what long-term effect the 3 debates had? And number two, as I recall, Biden was very positive in helping to get Obama elected. Do we have a feel about the 2 vice presidential candidates' long-term effect on their candidate?
Question was about 2 things. One was the effect of the debates on the final outcome. The other is the 2 vice presidential candidates. What effect did they have? The debates are another thing that are difficult to. I mean, I've played around with trying to figure out, for example, what effect, for example, the debates had on the 1960 election. And it turns out it's very difficult to figure out for all sorts of reasons. You know, we know their initial impact. What we don't know is how much of it lingered till Election Day. In this case, I doubt it had much effect because all of the polling right after the debates indicated that Hillary Clinton was seen as having won all 3 of them. And you would think she would have won a good deal more decisively if the debates had much of an impact. Vice presidential candidates historically have had a very low impact on the final outcome. People vote for president, not for vice president. There are exceptional cases where a vice president is seen as particularly unqualified, like Sarah Palin, Dan Quayle, where the selection seems to have hurt the presidential ticket. I don't think either of the vice presidents was seen as dramatically unqualified in the same way that, as I say, Quayle and Palin were both seen by many people. I think both probably sent some reassuring signals to people, but I don't think they had much of an effect. I've certainly seen no compelling evidence to that effect. Some people, yeah.
Getting back to the Electoral College, isn't it part of the Constitution? And if so, it would have to be approved by, 66% of the states.
Well, he asked about the Electoral College. Let me just say the requirement for an amendment is 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress, and then approval by 3/4 of the state legislatures. So the Constitution was deliberately made difficult to amend. They did not want people amending it every other year, and so it's a high hurdle. Now, you had more to the question.
I was just going to say, if I'm from North Dakota, there's no reason I wouldn't.
That's another problem. That's another reason why we've still got it. Is small states are seen as small states believe that they get a lot from the Electoral College. Now, to be sure, the small state effect is very selective. It gives New Hampshire a lot more attention than it would get otherwise. North Dakota still gets completely ignored because not only are they small, but they're small and overwhelmingly Republican.
But they have an opportunity to vote for this.
Yeah, if you were to talk to the average North Dakota politician, what they would probably say is, well, we don't get a whole lot of attention under current Electoral College, but in some future system we might, and it's hard to imagine any circumstance in which we get a lot of attention under a pure popular vote system. And you're absolutely right. For the ratification process, it's 3/4 of the total number of states, which is to say each state counts as one. So getting the ratification from California is no more valuable than getting North Dakota to ratify. Yeah.
Is it not true that there is a way to eliminate the effectiveness of the Electoral College with an agreement that I've heard Massachusetts has even signed on to, where we agree to submit or use our electoral vote toward the person who wins the popular election, and that would not require a constitutional amendment?
She asked if there is another way to effectively neutralize the Electoral College, and there is a plan that has been floated by a group, and the name of the group is escaping me at the moment, but it's a number of groups actually are pushing for it. And the way, the idea of the system is this: the Constitution says it gives great discretion to the states in terms of how they select their members of the Electoral College and how they are to be instructed. And so the idea is you could get enough states to pass a law that says, regardless of who carries our state, our electoral votes will go to the national popular vote winner. And if you could get enough states, if you could get a sufficient number of states to add up to more than 270 electoral votes, then effectively we would have a national popular vote system. Is it clear? I hope I'm explaining it. I mean, it's a complicated system, but I hope I'm explaining it clearly. Now, that system, even though I concede it will be very difficult to pass a constitutional amendment, that system seems to me fraught with problems. To begin with, it's a little unclear if it's constitutional. There is also a provision in the Constitution that says that interstate compacts can only take place if they are approved by Congress. And it might arguably be the case that what constitutes an interstate compact is a little unclear. But it might be that that's an interstate compact and would require congressional approval. The other problem is that I worry that under that system that you could have a case where depending on what happens or what is likely to happen in the popular vote and in the Electoral College, that you could find a number of states that would make last-minute changes. Oh, we said we'd give our votes to the popular vote winner, but you know what, we've changed our minds. Difficult to say whether that option is open to them, whether they would take advantage of it. I would feel much safer trying to go the constitutional amendment route, but as I've already said, that's going to be difficult and in the short run almost certainly impossible. On the other hand, that proposal, the one that goes via states adopting legislation, has been out there now for, at least 10 years, I'd say, and it has not gotten all that far along. It's still, California signed onto it, and Massachusetts, but it's still more than 100 electoral votes from taking effect. Yeah.
What has to be done to terminate the filibuster?
The filibuster can be terminated if if a majority of the Senate, no, I think it's 2/3 of the senators want to. The Constitution gives each House enormous discretion in setting its own rules. And the Senate has had filibuster rules going back for, several centuries now, or to at least more than one century now. So what it would require is now. The problem typically is that when one party is in the majority, they say, we think the Senate we think the filibuster is an awful idea. Whereas when a party's in the minority, and this is both parties do this, both parties are hypocritical this way, they suddenly say, oh no, the filibuster's wonderful, it prevents rash, unpopular legislation, it's the palladium of our liberties. The Democrats actually took how they did this is I can explain it in some detail, but they actually did eliminate the filibuster for judicial nominees. And now that the Republicans are in the majority and the Republicans have control of the presidency, I've already seen one Democratic senator say, that really was a bad idea. We shouldn't have done that. I would like to see, I'm not sure I'd want to see it eliminated entirely. I think there are very occasional circumstances where it ought to be eliminated. But the notion that every bill requires 60 votes to get through the Senate just strikes me as absurd. And I would like to see it eliminated. Yeah.
Have you seen any numbers indicating age groups as far as how they voted?
The general pattern was that younger people were more favorable towards Hillary Clinton and older people were more favorable towards Donald Trump. I don't have the exact numbers. I don't remember the exact numbers, but if you're interested, if you go on the CNN.com website, and they have a complete printout of the exit poll results, and they break it down by age. Yeah.
I'm sure I learned at one point in school how amendments to the Constitution are made, but would you refresh that, please?
Sure. How are the amendments to the Constitution made? They, as I say, in order to pass an amendment, you first need to have it approved by 2/3 vote from both houses of Congress. Then it gets sent to the state legislatures. and 3/4 of them must approve it. So it's a long and complicated process.
Isn't there also provision, another way of doing it that's never been used?
Yes, okay, the way I described is the way it is typically done, or has been, in fact, almost invariably has been done. There is a provision that says you can propose an amendment if 2/3 of the state's petition, Congress is required to call a National Constitutional Convention. And that National Constitutional Convention would then frame the amendment, and then it would have to be sent off to the states again for their approval. That has never been done, and there are lots of questions about how well it would work, or how it would work at all. On the other hand, as I've tried to tell people, if you want to impose term limits for Congress, that's the way you're going to have to go. Because there is no way that 2/3 of both houses of Congress are going to vote to limit their own terms. Pardon? Well, I mean, they brought it up in the House, and it was promptly voted down, which is my point. Yeah.
How do they determine the number of electors in each state?
How do they determine the number of electors in each state? It's the number of representatives plus the number of senators. So Massachusetts has 9 members in the U.S. House of Representatives. It has 2 senators, like every other state, so therefore it has 11 electoral votes. New Hampshire, by the same logic, has 4. California has 55. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Can I call him? Well, go ahead. Yeah, since I called that in.
Electoral college question. Instead of getting rid of it, if we had, like Maine, of course, is the delegates. Do you think that would make it more fair?
She asked about the system that exists for the Electoral College in Maine. Most states, 48 of 50, in fact, award, actually 49 of 51 if you add in the District of Columbia, award their electoral votes on a winner-take-all basis. That is to say, if you win one more vote than your opponent, than your nearest opponent in a state, you get all the electoral votes. Even if the election is very, very close, like you may remember in 2000, George Bush ended up carrying the state of Florida by 536 votes out of about 5 million cast. Nevertheless, he won every one of Florida's electoral votes. Now, their states, as I've already said, have a lot of discretion as to how to award their electoral votes. There are 2 states, Maine and Nebraska, that award it according to what is called a districted system. And that is to say, if you win a majority of the vote in a congressional district, any congressional district in the state, you get 1 electoral vote for that state. And if you win a majority or a plurality of the votes in the state as a whole, you get 2. And so that way, technically, Maine could split 3-1 in its electoral votes. I haven't seen the final results this time around. Nebraska had, I believe Nebraska this time, I think in the end it was Trump carried all 3 congressional districts. It turns out that, I mean, if you did it that way, it might affect campaigning in the sense that now you would have an incentive to campaign in California. It turns out that a districted system would probably have a large bias towards the Republican Party. So the Democrats are not likely to want to adopt that. But any state legislature that wants to do it can. But for example, if you're in California and you're part of the state legislature, which is very strongly Democratic, the last thing you want to do is pass a law that would give more electoral votes to the Republicans, which is what that law would do. So it's not likely to be widely adopted. Yeah.
It seems to me that passing laws and executive order is too much power in the hands of any person. What why would that come about at all without having to go to Congress?
She asked about executive orders and how much power they give to the executive. I entirely agree. I think it gives too much power to the president. I thought that when George Bush was president. When George Bush was president, a lot of Democrats said, oh, isn't this awful, all these things he's doing unilaterally by executive order. Well, what happened to Congress? And then Barack Obama got in and everybody said, oh, well, if he wants to do it, or Democrats said, okay, if he wants to do it, that's okay. I thought both of them were wrong to do those things. I think in particular, I think any plausible reading of the Constitution is that Congress has the power to declare war. And I think it is awful that presidents can launch wars without the approval of Congress. But restraining the president is difficult. And the courts, I think, unfortunately, have been entirely too unwilling to say to the president, no, you can't do this. That's an abuse of executive power. In particular, on issues of whether the president has the power to declare war, the courts have consistently ducked the question and just said, well, we're not going to interfere with that one.
One last question.
Yeah, go ahead.
When I was growing up, I lived in a household where I had a Democratic father and a Republican grandmother. And they would quite often debate issues. And I can remember feeling strongly about candidates in each party that I respected, that I felt would be a good choice. Today, I don't feel that way. I don't feel like I have that many people to look toward to be able to do some of the things that I felt were happening. If you were giving advice, and this was something I had thought of running for office a bit at one point, if you were giving some general advice as a political science professor to somebody who was thinking of running for office, given how unpopular Congress is right now, what couple of points might you point out, might make them?
Well, she asked about what advice I would give to somebody running for Congress. Sadly, a lot of my, I wouldn't say it's advice, but a lot of what I've learned studying Congress is about why it turned out the way it did. I would like to see more moderates in Congress. Unfortunately, if you were, say, if you are a representative from Massachusetts, which is to say you're a Democrat, with rather rare exceptions, your problem, the thing you worry about, is not that you will be beaten by a Republican in the general election. It's that you will be beaten by somebody in the Democratic primary because you're not liberal enough. And therefore, that tends to, if you are somebody like Ed Markey or Catherine Clark, who's my representative, that's where you look at. And if there's any, the last thing you want to do is appear overly cooperative with Donald Trump for the next 4 years. And similarly with Republicans, I don't know if you remember in one of Barack Obama's State of the Union addresses, he was saying that under his health care plan, illegal immigrants would not get would not qualify. And one representative yelled out, "You lie." Very uncivil, rude thing to do. He was easily reelected. Whereas, if you are Arlen Specter, not admittedly my favorite representative or my favorite senator, but was one of 3 Republicans who voted for the the Obama stimulus package in 2009, and it was almost immediately said, well, he ain't going to win his next Republican primary, and he was so convinced that he in fact switched parties, lost in the Democratic primary as well. But It's a difficult road to hoe. The other problem, let me just, I don't mean to keep everybody. The other problem is that there's a phenomenon in the survey data. People dislike Congress, but they like their own member. So if you ask people, do you approve or disapprove of the way Congress is performing its job? You only get these days about 11, 12% who say I approve. I mean, that's just massively unpopular. But if you ask, what do you think about your own representative? Typically, your own representative gets about a 55% approval rating. And so, even though, I mean, you know, one of my students said, you know, saw that the congressional approval numbers and said, aren't these people all going to get turned out? And I said, no. The truth of the matter is, about 90% of them will get reelected. And in fact, that was exactly what happened. So it's not an easy nut to crack. I mean, if I were advising a candidate on purely Machiavellian grounds, I would say, if you're running in a Democratic primary, seem very liberal. If you're running in a Republican primary, seem very conservative. As I say, that's not my my own personal philosophy, but that's what anyway, thank you all.